Okay, so, again, I know that in some of the communications, this was framed as a town hall. I think there are some nuanced differences. I would frame this more as a conversation. And again, my hopes today are to give you some of my own personal thoughts on my gratitude for the last 4 months. I've got a short anecdote to share with you, and then we'll get into the meat of the conversation, which is really to share with you some of the feedback that we've collected, to give you some expansion on the plans for in-person instruction, expansions on home learning plans, some conversation around supporting students and families, some thoughts around ways in which the school has invested already and will, out of necessity, need to invest further, both in the physical plant and some infrastructure, close with some thoughts around anti-racist and anti-biased education, and then open it up for the questions. So before I do anything else, I want to ground myself in gratitude because over the last 120 days, I have found myself often filled with gratitude. And to me, that is a frame that has helped me stay focused on the most pressing priorities for the school. So I want to extend an enormous thank you to my leadership team, Anne and Kristen and Jordy and Larry and Billy and Laura and Julie and Liz. Those folks have worked tirelessly on behalf of the school, and I continue to appreciate the efforts that you all have made. I want to also acknowledge the Families Association leadership team, Sharon and Bronwyn and Jeannie, who have continued to give me really good insights and feedback from their conversations in the community. I'm especially grateful for those of you who've reached out over the last 4 months to provide your feedback, good, bad, or otherwise. I'll also share that I'm immensely grateful to those of you who've reached out, whether it be to check in on me personally, to share your gratitude for the school. I think those are conversations that I have really appreciated. I've continued to share that I've leaned on regional colleagues, heads of school at Lake Michigan Association of Independent Schools, but I have to especially acknowledge Nancy Nasser at Ancona and Joy Hurd at Lake Forest Country Day. Those are two heads of school with whom I've spoken frequently and have, though they're not on the call, Nancy does serve on our board of trustees. Though I don't think she's on the call, for DSL, an incredible acknowledgement for your mentorship and friendship. To the board of trustees, many of you, I think, are listening right now. Your willingness to go above and beyond what you expected to be your role in service of our school has been phenomenal. A special acknowledgement to Lori Morlock, our board chair, and Paul Herbert, our board treasurer, who have been incredibly helpful in some of the decision making and have overextended themselves. I was on the phone with them until late last night. So to our entire board of trustees, thank you. There are many teachers on the call, many of whom are, over the last couple of weeks, running programs themselves. And I want to make sure to the teachers and the staff that are listening, on behalf of all of us parents at RPMS, I want to say thank you. And finally, I think she's listening in the other room, but to my own family, to Leah, to my boys who have been deprioritized as we've worked through this, and to my ma, who has gone over and above. I wanted to start with that framing of gratitude. I think for many of us, as we've had conversations about this crisis, you've been able to frame it and find gratitude for the pieces. And I think that's an important way to move forward. I want to look backwards before we look forwards. Today, by my best calculation, is 117 days since we had to close 1800 West Balmoral. And I thought back to March 12th, which was the day before Friday, March 13th, Friday the 13th, when there were some suspicions that there would be widespread closures and impacts on our city and our state. And I think, as was the case with many of you, I rushed to the grocery store and tried my best to prepare for what was to come. You know, in my life, thankfully, I'd never experienced a disruption in the food supply chain, but I think there were murmurings that that may be a piece of it. So Leah and I decided what were the most important things. We stocked up on sustenance, worried that it might be a prolonged period before the grocery stores felt safe. So I made sure to buy the boys' favorite things like the mac and cheese in the purple box, not the blue box. Please, not the blue box. I made sure we had the right peanut butter and a few gallons of milk. I bought a new board game. If any of you are interested in a game of Settlers of Catan, the boys and I are more than up for it. And I also bought a very large bag of dried black beans. It seemed as though those dried foods might be a reasonable thing to have on hand. The next day, Friday the 13th, we received word from the governor that the schools across Illinois would close. And from that moment until moments ago, the planning for the building's closure commenced. In March, our primary goal was to keep the students connected to one another. And we knew that this was an unprecedented time. And I don't know about any of you, but I think I've used unprecedented more than I care to ever again, and hope to not have to use it. And then that evening on Friday the 13th, I made a very large batch of beans and rice. And they were good. I mean, not like you're sitting in a campsite and sustenance feels good. They were legitimately good. So much so that I made a second batch and I shoved them in the freezer, not knowing what was to come. And I think for all of us, there were steps we took to prepare ourselves that perhaps were useful and perhaps were not. And I found that same to be true looking retrospectively at the efforts of the school from the date of the building's closure until now. There were efforts that we made that were incredibly impactful. And looking backwards, there were choices that we made and prioritized that perhaps, hopefully, we'll never have the opportunity to do it again, but I would certainly do some things differently. As the weeks went past, the stay-at-home order was extended and then extended again. And then in-person school for the year was over. And during that time, our priorities continued to shift. The way we asked the teachers to prioritize their time shifted. We began to understand that the students were hungry for personal interaction that they had come to know in in-person learning. We learned about new tools and technology. We gathered feedback, and we made a priority of streamlining the communications from the school so that you weren't getting 97 emails on any single day. As teachers and administrators, we put on new hats, including software developer, end user experience evaluator, digital and e-learning content creator, among myriad others. And as parents, we also put on new hats. Hats that were unfamiliar at times, and certainly hats that forced us to shift our own priorities at home. We had to play the role of teacher and playmate and counselor and IT support for our 4 and 5-year-olds. Hats perhaps we didn't think that we would have to wear. All the while, the teachers and parents worked to support the students, to perpetuate those connections that we've worked so hard to develop over time at school. For me personally, as days filled with Zoom calls and conversations with regional heads, as I took an innumerable amount of webinars on contact tracing and the relationship between square footage and the number of students that can be in a classroom. I'd pull out those frozen bags of beans and rice when it was just too much to make lunch in any given day, and found new and innovative ways to prepare for my children the growingly boring meal. Arlo's favorite became slicing off a piece of frozen beans and rice, melting a ridiculous amount of butter in a frying pan, and frying both sides of the beans and rice. I'm not sure that that's healthy, but it certainly made lunch prep an independent task for him. As we continued to learn through March and April and May and June, we continued to refine our programs. In fact, we are continuously still refining those programs. It has been invaluable to hear the experiences of the teachers this summer who are trialing new learning platforms, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And another thing that I came to understand as the months pressed on is that many of us found ourselves drawing farther and farther inward. And I worried that the bonds of our community would fray. There were no chances for high fives in the driveway, nor were there chances for a hand on the shoulder to redirect a child's attention. And no more in-person interaction was to come in the months that we were away from 1800 Balmoral. During that time, RPMS listened to students and to parents, and we learned and are continuing to learn how to do better, and we're learning what we all need from a home learning environment. Today, I would like to share with you some of the feedback we've received over these last 117 days. I'll share the plans to keep our children safe as we return to school, and I'll share what we've learned about the ways we can support our students at home. I'll even share my black bean recipe if you're finding yourself in need of some freezer meals. So with that said, I want to start with the feedback that we'd collected. I very much appreciate those of you who are willing to participate in the surveys. There were 93 submissions in our first administration of the survey in April and 118 in May. I want to flip through some of the priorities quickly, and then I'll come back to these key takeaways. These were kind of an overall impression of the program, and I'll flip to the next slide in a second, but you see that the survey results between April and May were somewhat static. And I will say that that survey data was affirmational of the experience that I found across my conversations, that this crisis hit each of us differently. And as such, our welcome of the home learning and our own children's ability to access it varied widely. I wanted to pull one other piece of data from the surveys themselves, and this is two pieces around structure and teacher engagement. You can see that as the colors lighten, satisfaction grows. That's noted over here. And what I see and is heartening is that those of you who were finding the teacher's engagement significantly better than expectations grew over our time of home learning. I'm going to come back here to the key takeaways in terms of the focus groups, which I will expand on a little bit as we talk about the ways in which both in-person learning and a home learning program, should that arise. I think that a big takeaway was centralized and streamlined communication was helpful. So folks had very positive feedback on the classroom landing pages, the conglomeration of Zoom links. What I found through my conversation was that even young children, first and second graders, gained the ability to use those home landing pages independently. And my hope is that those really helped the families in terms of accessing the e-learning platforms. Another thing that we heard often was that teacher accessibility was incredibly valuable. And we got some feedback on the ways in which that accessibility was facilitated that we're looking at in terms of how to best schedule the one-to-ones, how to best schedule things like small group instruction, which we'll come back to as a priority in a later slide. And another piece around the prioritization of efforts in terms of our planning was that for all students, feedback, accountability, and assessment are areas of growth for us when we are faced with the prospect of home learning, especially for our youngest students. So with that said, I want to move on. Just to underscore this graphic that was in the reopening plan that you all received. The overwhelming priority for us has been the health and safety of our community. That has been from the outset as we've considered any sort of in-person instruction. And as we've looked at the ways in which we can prioritize students' mental health through home learning, that's also become a very important piece of our planning process. You can see that on-campus learning relies on this phase 4 of Illinois' reopening plan. Even just in the time between this document's creation and today, what I've come to further understand is that there are ways in which if we were to, regress into phase 3, it's very likely, based on my understanding today, that we would be able to bring our youngest students back into the building. So I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit, but you can see here, and this is in the home learning document that was shared again this morning with the links for this email. I think it provides a good outline of what we're doing now and what will be the case in August and September. I'm going to start by focusing on in-person instruction because for the leadership team, that's been our focus right now. We are very optimistic that we will be able to go back to school after Labor Day. Based on the way that the numbers are trending, we do anticipate for there to be times where through government mandate, we do have to go back into home learning. But right now, based on what we're hearing, we do expect to start in person. And to clarify, I got some questions about what does that mean? We are fortunate to have a physical plant that allows us to bring every student for 5 full days every week. So we're trying to define the minute details like arrival schedules that will allow for the proper traffic flow. But based on the use of our space in the school and our ability to create, to keep student-teacher ratio low, we do expect to be able to run programming for all of the students. One of the things that allows us to do that is a decreased student-teacher ratio. One of the things I know that I'll want to do in the future is meet with each program level again and give them updates on what that will look like. But for instance, when we're looking at the 3 to 6 program, we expect to run 6 classrooms with the 2 teachers. All of the classrooms will have a Montessori trained teacher, and we expect to keep those numbers around 15. That's really good news. The other good news about our building is that all of the Children's House classrooms have exterior exits. So drop off can come straight into the classroom, which will ease the traffic flow. In 6 to 9, what we're looking at is taking the 5 classrooms and splitting them into 8 groups to keep our ratios down. And I'll talk a little bit about exposure. We are fortunate to have 8 fully trained Montessori teachers so that each of those 8 6 to 9 groups will have a trained Montessorian as their instructor. Similarly, in 9 to 12, we're looking at breaking the 4 classrooms down into 6 groups with with a Montessori trained teacher in each, and middle school will continue to operate in check-in groups. It will look differently in terms of the day-to-day experience of the students. I'm going to give you one small example as we work to flesh out all the details. If you think about a small but significant part of our program, like art class, we know that it's not safe for the art teacher to be exposed to every student from 1st through 8th grade. So we're coming up with ways in which we can facilitate art class that with all of the students. We don't quite know what that means yet. So I want to take a minute. I do see a couple of questions that I will answer in this slide. So because of our size, I think we can be nimble and adaptable and responsive. A question that I want to address is the question around what happens if Chicago Public Schools does not open. We are still awaiting the guidance at the city level. We have reviewed the Illinois State Board of Ed protocols. We've been in very careful contact with the other independent school heads. I had a really good conversation with the principal at Amundsen. I even went so far as to engage in a Twitter exchange with whoever it is that runs the Chicago Teachers Union social media account. What's not yet clear to me is if Chicago Public Schools presents a plan and the teachers union does not accept that plan. My understanding is that the teachers cannot strike over that plan, but they could stage a walkout. I don't have a clear understanding at this point if the CPS teachers staged a walkout, will we be able to come to school? My understanding right now is yes, though that is a question that I've yet to answer. So let me pause. I see that there are 3 questions that have come in, especially around this decreased student to teacher ratio. So one question reads, does that mean some of the new instructors will be current assistants? It is a little bit different at each program level. So for 3 to 6, the 6 lead teachers will continue to be the lead teachers. In 6 to 9, we have 8 instructors who are fully Montessori trained. Erin and Maura and Juliana and Mary and Melissa and Annalise and Michael and Daria. So those 8 6 to 9 instructors are all fully Montessori trained. For a number of them, they have been serving as interns and assistants and have been honing their instructional skills. But the notion is, yes, that we were moving towards a co-teaching scenario in 6 to 9 as we run it in 9 to 12, so that there will be 2 lead teachers in each of the 6 to 9 classrooms. And when I get to exposure, I think that it'll make sense. We make the smaller groups, but each of them gets a pod of students. Another question was, Aspen will have all students at one time. So yes, which ties into the next question, which is where will all of these classrooms be? Because we know that some of the things like art and music will be hard to implement, it's very likely, based on our planning right now, that we will utilize these auxiliary spaces as classrooms so that we can keep the ratios of students to teachers low. There's a question around, will the class groupings be mixed age or will the grades be grouped? Especially interested in those moving into a new program. One of the things we're looking at is this is the problem with looking at questions as I also answer them. So we're looking at the different scenarios, especially focused on the children who are transitioning between kindergarten and first grade, third grade and fourth grade, and sixth grade and middle school. We don't have a clear answer there. There's a question around the difference between a strike and a walkout. To my mind, a strike is over a contractual issue where they're renegotiating contracts, and a walkout is not a contractual issue, it's a refusal to work. That is my basic understanding. I am by no means an expert. There's another question around, is there any plan for families to have a choice whether their children go to back to school or do e-learning? And this is a question we are actively exploring right now. I have heard from a very small number of families, 2 to be precise, that there would be an interest in a 100% at-home scenario. For these 2 different families, it is 2 different reasons. One lives in a multi-generational household. The other has an underlying condition within the household. We are looking at the interest. So I would say, for those of you who are saying to yourselves, I cannot personally envision a scenario that I would feel comfortable sending my child back to school in person, please reach out to your program director and say, yes, we would in fact be interested in a 100% e-learning platform. So there are many other questions, including staffing and age groups. And the big one is putting all of this detail in writing, and when can we expect this? So I've been grateful to learn from other schools, especially Adrian Finley Odell at Roycemore and Audrey Parrott at Near North. They have expansive plans, including kind of day-by-day schedules. I would say we are probably middle to early next week before we are able to publish those. I want to keep going here because I want to highlight some of the things that we have to do and then come back around to any questions that linger at the end. We know that things like sharing materials is going to be a challenge. So looking at provisions for the Montessori materials, but also looking at the technology infrastructure. So one of the challenges, especially at the 6 to 9 level, was that there was not an e-learning platform. For Melissa and Annalise and Daria, who have climbed the vertical learning curve of Seesaw, it has been incredibly helpful and will be a piece we implement even in person. We've talked about the necessity of homework being a high touch sort of protocol, and using the e-learning platform, which is called Seesaw, to be used for homework so that the kids can be familiar with it, the families, the teachers, but that requires an increase both in the hardware and software. In terms of the health and safety protocols, those were the pieces that we really tried to focus on in the reopening document that was sent last week. To the best of our understanding right now, children from 3 on up should remain masked. This is guidance coming from the Medical Advisory Committee that has convened. Thank you to those folks who have been incredibly giving of their time, and also spots like the American Academy of Pediatricians and other national independent schools groups. You know, again, my current understanding of our state's trends is that we do expect to be back in September, though I do acknowledge that we are living in uncertain times. So that is the reality. For right now, our real goal is that we are prepared to face the uncertainty and understanding that interruptions will be happening. So again, to kind of summarize, We do feel optimistic that we can bring all of the children into the school building using the auxiliary spaces like the music room, the art room, those sorts of spaces that are not currently deployed as classrooms to keep the ratios low. So we will be using those auxiliary classroom or spaces in the building as classroom spaces. So I'm gonna, being conscious of my time, my goodness, 10:36. So then we're also simultaneously preparing for the realities of a government mandated shutdown that we, based on the mandates of the governor, we will have to be at home for periods of the year. Based on the feedback we've received, every program will have adjustments to their home learning. Some of the key pieces will be a materials lending library. That was a piece that I think we talked about the difficulty of replicating a Montessori philosophy at home. We do think that in conjunction with a video library, an asynchronous offering, the materials lending library is those two pieces can work in concert very well. We've heard that the one-to-one check-ins for students and parents are incredibly valuable. And what we're working to do right now is balance the teacher's time between one-to-one and small group. We've also heard some feedback around the tools that we used for scheduling and looking at how to simultaneously create predictable schedules for the children and an ease of user experience from the parent end. We know that accountability and assessment for the children is going to be key. I think I've shared with many of you that for my own children at home, it was somewhere between week 3 and 4 that, well, Aaron says you have to do this kind of wore off. Now, when Aaron started meeting with Arlo one-on-one again, that accountability ramped right back up. And again, we're going to use the one-to-one check-ins and the small groups for the children to be able to prioritize. We heard around this point on clear expectations that the importance of teacher guidance in prioritizing your time is going to be very, very important. And then also we are running a parent support series this summer for Carol and Sarah and Audrey. If you're listening, thank you there. Those supports will continue through the school year, including a momentary pause and level setting at any point that we're entering back into home learning. The other thing that folks felt was important was a transparency in the ways in which we're allocating administrators' time, teachers' time, so that we have a clear view of where our time and where our priorities are being spent. So I saw a number of questions come through. Let me see if I can come through them. So there was a question on face shields versus masks. Based on my understanding, face shields are less effective than masks, and we are continuing to do the best research possible on mask wearing. But right now, as I understand it, masks are superior to face shields. There have been a number of questions about optimizing the outdoor spaces. So thinking about the luxury of our building having a rooftop space and a sizable meadow. You know, we're looking at the feasibility of closing off the parking lot so we can use that as an outdoor space. And knowing that outdoors is superior in terms of mitigation of the virus, those are absolutely conversations that we're having. There was a conversation around retrofits to the HVAC system. We are in current negotiations with the HVAC provider. We have not decided on a solution, but we are looking at filtration or there's a light scrubbing technique. Thankfully, the facilities planning team has been all the way on top of those things, including things like, excuse me, plexiglass dividers that will keep Donna and the front desk staff safe, and potentially also let us loosen some of the physical distancing mandates in the classroom. So there was a question, is your 5-day everyday calculation based on full current RPMS population? So yes, based on our current numbers. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about enrollment later, but we at this point are not enrolling any more, especially 3 to 6 students, to be sure that we can keep the ratios down. Will the small groups during remote be the same class they are in for in-person? We're looking at the best way to get the students in front of their, I guess, homeroom, for lack of a better word, teacher. So yes, and then there will be some lessons that we're finding are more appropriate for the large group. But the ways in which we'll get the teachers in front of their students, again, coming back to these middle bullet points, will be the balance between the one-to-one time and the instructional focus on small groups. We've had really, really good conversations with the teachers around what is the right amount of time for the children. So when we think about a one-to-one check-in, for instance, we've had really meaningful conversations about the duration that we can expect, and also really good conversations with the parents about the balance between that one-to-one check-in time for the students and also for the parents. There's a question around learning management system. I would be interested in hearing that. Right now, for 6 to 9, we're looking at, again, Seesaw and Google Classroom. If we go to home learning, what will frequency and length look like? Daily Zoom meetings and check-in to create a routine. So again, that is a balance we're trying to strike, because we know that there is value in consistency. We also know that different families have very different needs. I spoke with one mom in particular who shared with me that her children get up at 5:30 in the morning. I don't see us likely offering a morning meeting before 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And I know that for a family who would run a morning work period from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., that morning meeting in the middle of the morning could be intrusive. I would love to be able to say that we are adjusting our mantra from follow the child to follow the family, because if anything has become crystal clear, it is the diverse experience we've had. So I don't know that that fully answers the question. So there's another question around a 3-year-old keeping a mask on all day. I will share with you my own personal experience as a parent. Leah and I made the choice this week to enroll our children in outside of the home programs. And for Luca, who is 4 and change, the instructors there have been incredibly patient and have helped him to remember the importance of wearing the masks, and also knowing that the youngest children will need the most support with that. We are working to better understand how very small children may or may not carry a lesser viral load, and we'll be looking for any updated guidance on very young children as transmission vectors of the virus. So, as would be the case for a 3-year-old who is having trouble with toileting, the teachers will be supportive of the children as they normalize mask wearing. I will say for Luca, there is an incredible positive peer pressure in his experience these last couple of weeks. And then the last question is around increasing the airflow within the classrooms while the kids are inside. Again, the great thing about all of our classrooms, save for a couple, is that they do have windows that can open, and we will, to the best of our ability, get that fresh air in. So I'm going to keep going. Thank you for the questions. Hopefully they have not taken me down too many tangents. I think the next should be a little quicker to go through. In terms of supporting families and students, there are a number of pieces that we want to put in place. For Liz and Kristen and Jordy especially, I want to thank you for your continued accessibility to our families. I would say for those of you who have program-specific questions, those people would be your very best points of contact until we're able, and I will share some of the draft that we have at the end of the call. Again, we're going to continue the support series for parents, especially at any point at which we have to put home learning into place. So this notion of an onboarding call, we know that arriving at school is going to look different. I can't today tell you exactly how that's going to look, but we know that you, the parents, and also really the children will need help in understanding what's going to be different. So that will likely look like a video running you through the drop-off procedure. I don't know if it will be me getting my temperature taken as I come in the door, or if we'll volunteer one of my children. But this notion that we can, as often as possible, normalize the new routines of school until we're on the other side of this virus. I'm incredibly glad for the continued conversations with the new school counselor, Kayla Willis, who I think is listening today. We are finding the best way to deploy her in the school, knowing what we know about physical distancing. We've continued to be able to offer tuition assistance to those families who have reached out and explained the financial hardship that they are experiencing. We are going to continue to prioritize individualization, and above all else, we are looking at our values and our mission to guide us as we move through this. So I want to talk a little bit about the planning and how I personally and the leadership team has been thinking about the challenges that next year will present. We know that in-person school and home learning are going to be parts of our lives. Our goal is to get the school successfully through this crisis so that we can come back and have the teachers and the community that we've all grown to love. So as we've made decisions, there are certainly things that have to change now, but it's with the hopes that they can go back to the way that they were then. I will say that in my years as an administrator at the school, which are still less than my years as a teacher at the school, I can very clearly remember the very first conversation I had with Julie Spear. And in that role, she reminded me that as educational director, it was my job to advocate for the teachers because they are our school's greatest resource. And I can't underscore that enough, that the ways in which our teachers know and understand the development of our students is our greatest strength. And I will again voice my gratitude to the teachers who are listening now. In terms of improvements to the physical plant, we are looking at things like the HVAC system, which I've mentioned. We're looking at potential implications for the IT support. We're looking at things like one-to-one solutions for technology, even for the youngest students. I want to give a special shout out to 3 members of our community, Amy Skeen, Jess Berger, and Megan Beer. I want to thank you for the time that you've given and the thought that you've provided to the school in thinking about ways in which we might diversify revenue streams through things like corporate and foundation giving. That feedback has been incredibly helpful as we have progressed our thinking. And then finally, a continued commitment to the community's well-being. I apologize for the typo. There should be an apostrophe S. And using all of these pieces of that puzzle to support the well-being. I want to close before I address some of the questions by thinking about the work that's been done over the past 15 years at RPMS in terms of developing anti-racist and anti-bias education. There are pieces within all of our children's curriculum which provide windows and mirrors. So mirrors in terms of representation so that children can see themselves represented in the materials, but also windows into the lives of others. Certainly that is not the only piece of the curricular puzzle. I'm proud of the work that the staff has done in terms of materials audits, which examine potential biases and the conversations and the learning that the adults have done. In terms of staff priorities, right now, we are looking really carefully at what our next steps are. In a pre-COVID world, we had a very clear training arc. That training for the summer, which would have qualified some of our teachers as trainers, has evaporated, so we are reevaluating. On behalf of the Families Association, I've got to say that also the Families Association has committed to finding ways to support the parents in their work in building anti-racist and anti-biased tendencies in themselves and their families. FA has asked that if there is anyone listening with an expertise in these sorts of training arenas, that we would invite your voice into the conversation. I think for me, it's been interesting as I've had conversations in my own life. I know with clarity that as a white person, it is my duty to help other white folks understand what they don't yet. And if you are willing, I would be interested in hearing how you personally have directed your energy to that end. I would really appreciate the willingness to have that conversation. Again, I just want to underscore that the Families Association is looking for anyone within the community or access to resources that has expertise in facilitating conversations around anti-racism and anti-biased trainings or facilitation. Excuse me. So all that being said, I want to address some of the questions that have come up very carefully. So first, there have been a number of questions about the PPP funds and their deployment. We did apply and accept the PPP funds. As it was intended, those funds were designated to safeguard against decreased revenue due to COVID-19 and to protect payroll for our employees in an effort to ensure the vitality of our organization. Our inability to recruit and enroll new students through the spring has had a significant impact on our overall enrollment numbers for 2020-2021 to the tune of around 9% or approximately $750,000 in unrealized tuition revenue. In looking at the fall, we expect, though, the numbers of students to be down, the need for staffing to go up. That may sound counterintuitive, that we will need more adults to help less children. But because of the realities of the ways in which things are going to run, that is what we're looking at right now. We expect to incur between $300,000 and $500,000 in additional expenses, ensuring the safety of our community, including things like the HVAC and the materials lending libraries, the cleaning protocols that will be increased, increased custodial support, those sorts of things. I know that from early on, RPMS placed a high value on our teachers, and I'm proud that the school was able to maintain its support of its employees during this crisis. It's continued to be my goal to sustain RPMS, but also to see it thrive with all of the educators that we trust with our children's growth and development once we're past this pandemic. Regarding the questions that were posed specifically to the board has been meeting constantly as recently as late last night. As with all matters and in fulfilling their fiduciary responsibility to the school, I trust that the board will take the time to undertake the necessary analysis in order to best answer the questions submitted to them. There was a question around an extension of the withdrawal from the contract or reconsideration from the contract. I want to give kind of a slight color to some of my thinking there. When each of us signed our enrollment contracts in January or February, that obligated us as parents, and I include myself in that statement, to tuition for the following year. I presented and advocated to the board that because of folks' financial uncertainty and because of myriad other factors, I felt that it was just and fair to give people an opportunity to withdraw from those enrollment contracts. It is crucial for the school to be able to plan based on the number of students who will come back. And without a clarity around how many students, it is really, really difficult for us to do that planning. That's why we've asked for people to set a deadline of this Friday. In conversations, I've agreed to extend that deadline until next Wednesday. Wednesday is July the 15th. A couple of the pieces for us are especially reporting to our financiers in terms of our ability to meet our financial obligations, and also our ability to plan from a personnel perspective from the fall. Those two pieces in and of themselves are crucial to our. I understand and can empathize with the fact that we are asking you to make a decision in the face of uncertainty. As I'd said, I'll share a little bit more and give you a glimpse into some of the planning that we're working on at the end of the call, but we are asking for people to make that decision. I think I've answered the questions around programs and teachers. There was a question around exposure, and the exposure is this, the notions of exposure to the virus. I'm going to use my own family as an example. I do have something in writing that can be shared, but the basic notion is this. If you go all the way back to my communications in March, before we had to close the building, we were thinking about exposure in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary exposures. So for myself and for Arlo and Luca, if, for instance, I were confirmed COVID positive and Luca and Arlo would then become primary exposures or primarily exposed, it's my understanding that they would need to stay home, but the rest of their class could go on. Now, if either of them were confirmed positive, then their classrooms would then have to close. The tertiary exposure, so the students who are exposed to a secondary exposure, my understanding is that we would not have to close classrooms. There was a question around visitors to the school. So that impacts things like parent observations, volunteers to do sandpaper letters, and to run the library. Based on our current understanding, we are going to put those on pause and not be able to, or not allow those sorts of visitors into the building. You know, out of necessity, delivery drivers and those sorts of people who are bringing things to our school will have to be in. So that's my thought there. In terms of support for the children, so again, if I'm using my family as an example, and I am confirmed COVID positive, and Arlo has to stay home even though he is not symptomatic and would be ready for instruction. We are right now formulating the ways in which we can support those learners at home. The last question I'll address, and then I'll go back up and address any of the questions here in the chat. Many folks have asked around a rolling admission deadline. So for instance, if a family is not in a place where they can commit to enrolling in September, is there the possibility that we would look at a January admittance? And what I can say is that it is too early to be able to comment on that. Not knowing what our enrollment numbers are, I mean, I would say based on our numbers right now, we are full. There are conversations I have pending, and I also know that the contract reconsideration period is still open. There may be the opportunity, but I cannot commit to that at this point. So let me scroll up. There was a question around partial refunds for aftercare. I would say if you've not yet, please reach out to the business office. That's Larry DeStasi. If you don't have Larry's email, please reach out to me and I'm happy to provide it. Detail on the in-person and remote learning we are working on. There will likely be some draft, but it will be continually refined over the course of the summer. I think the advantage we have right now is learning from the teachers who are running summer school programs. I'll share personally, this week and next, I'm running a summer school program and it has absolutely been a highlight of my days. So I don't know that I will be able to tell you what is going to happen at 10:30 on Tuesdays for your child. I will be able to give you some further insight into what it will look like. Just to verify, yes, the tuition or the enrollment reconsideration extension is for everyone through next Wednesday, the 15th. There's a question around if a student's been exposed to a parent who has diagnosed with COVID and doesn't self-quarantine, will the school mandate the student to self-quarantine? So there are questions that I have, especially in the face of Mayor Lightfoot's new requirements for folks coming in from hotspots to quarantine. I got a very well-meaning question from a parent around traveling over Labor Day and the need to quarantine coming home. And I don't have an answer to that question right now. In fact, the last conversation I'd had with the medical advisory committee, we committed to looking at those primary, secondary, and tertiary exposures at our next call. There's a question around, and I apologize if I missed them all. I'm going to try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Will there be a hybrid learning model developed, start in person at home? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think I was getting at the fact that we are interested in hearing from folks if they are interested in a 100% home learning option. We're learning a whole lot from the teachers about what it takes to develop relationships online. But I don't know if that answers the question, Laura. How will early arrival and aftercare be socially distanced? Will there be enough supervisors to split the groups into smaller pods? So Before care continues to be a challenge that we have not fully solved. Aftercare, what we're looking at doing is running things a little bit differently. And based on my reading of the phase 4 guidance, the pods can be up to 50. So we could hypothetically take 2 6 to 9 classrooms and have all of the children who are looking for aftercare from those 2 rooms come together. That is the working solution right now. Asking around 6 to 9 teachers. Yes, right now for the fall, we're anticipating 8 6 to 9 classrooms versus 5 with smaller sizes. Classrooms without windows that open undergo remodeling. We are looking at that as a solution. We have not solved it yet. Decisions on a regular testing cadence for employees and students. I'm going to take that to mean COVID testing. What I would say from my own lived experience is a relationship with a primary care provider is very helpful in seeking out COVID testing. So if you've not yet, I would encourage you to initiate a conversation. We have not defined, excuse me, a testing cadence. And as of right now, we are not looking at part of the day in person and part of the day at home. We're planning for full days in person. So I'm going to pause there, see if there are other questions. So, that was not what I meant to do. So, all right, now we're back to just my smiling face, hopefully. Assessment. So we're looking at the capabilities of these e-learning platforms, especially for the youngest students. We're learning a lot from the 6 to 9 teachers who are working with small groups. So for instance, Annalise, I think, had 9 students in her language summer school session, and understanding the balance between the hour that she spent with them in person every day for 10 days versus the question around that assessment piece and the balance thereof. Excuse me. And I think all of that plays into that balance between the teacher's time live and in person and their needs for planning. For instance, when I reviewed the Near North plan, it demonstrated that there's only 2 hours in any given week for the teachers to plan. And I frankly find that insufficient. And I'm coming up with solutions on how to both keep students engaged, but also give the teachers the time to do the meaningful work of education. So Jennifer, I'm sorry, I've lost track of your Aspen question. So as promised, I can share just kind of a snippet of some of the plans we've got in development if technology works on my behalf. Just give me one moment, because I know there's questions around, will there be a fuller plan released before 7/15? Technology is not working on my behalf. Give me just one moment. All right, that is not working. There were some questions around the questions that were directed to the board specifically. And as I'd mentioned, I think the board is working on their deliberations. In talking with Lori and Paul specifically, I would expect a communication within the next couple of days around the questions that were directed specifically at the board. I would like to show you guys this plan because I'm quite proud of the way it's shaping up. I'm also beginning to lose my voice at the 70-minute mark. Thank you all for hanging in there with me. Let me see if I can pull this up just for a second, because I want to give you guys a sense of where we're at. Liz. Thank you for your patience. I think I am experiencing what many of the teachers have experienced. So again, this is a draft. I'm going to kind of zip through it because it is yet a draft, but included in this plan are, details around, and I think this is what people are after in terms of, codification of these details of on-campus learning, some of the e-learning tools that we'll use. It's got some details around traffic flow in and out of the building, which I think will be important as we consider coming back to campus. And then these are in draft form right now, but looking at the ways in which this is for home learning, a home learning schedule might look. So this is currently in development. I don't know, Liz, if you want to text me and give me an ETA, we're working on that as fast as humanly possible. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. No, we're not anticipating having all 5 check-in groups in the Aspen room. We're looking at 2 of the 5 check-in groups in the Aspen room, and then the other 3 in auxiliary spaces. Oh, Liz Shanahan, you are the best. Liz says end of the week for the learning modalities plan. All right, as we're ramping up, I'm gonna try to wrap up by 11:15, but is there any scenario discussed when the school will require, instead of recommend, a student to staff or staff to self-quarantine? So I think the question is around the relationship between symptoms and asking folks to stay home. So one of the challenges will be, for instance, if a child shows up to school, the past protocol had been you need to stay home for 24 hours without fever-reducing medicines. We know that number now goes up to 72 hours. There was a question that came in today about a persistent cough and how we would deal with a student who is perhaps having an allergic reaction to pollen in the air. Those are not 100% clear to me, though the depth of my own clarity exists within that reopening plan that was circulated last week. There's a question around testing requirements. That is not yet understood in terms of the necessity of a negative COVID test to return to school. I think those are the sorts of granular questions that we'll work to answer over the next, I think it's 62 days till Labor Day. Have any staff opted out of returning to in-person work? Not to this point, though conversations with staff continue to evolve. So I would say it's 11:15. I would like to draw the call to an end. If you have questions that did not get answered, please continue to reach out to me. Again, we hope to have you the best draft of our kind of learning plan to complement the health and safety plan that does include aspects of the curriculum near the end of the week. I've got to say to Anne, who I know is on the call, and to Liz, and to all of the team who's working on those documents, they are just hustling. And I think on behalf of all of us parents who are hungry for the information, thank you for that.